Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Wolf. As an IM fellow and a retired clinical hematologist, a bibliophile, and an amateur medical history buff who has helped plan today's conference, it is a great honor for me to introduce you today to Dr. Jeremy Greene, who stands as an internationally recognized academic colossus in the fields of medical history and public health. Because Dr. Greene is so well known to this audience, there's little need for me to list his innumerable titles, awards, accomplishments, and publications. As the William H. Welch Professor of Medicine, Johns Hopkins, Dr. Greene is today actually following in Dr. Welch's footsteps. 93 years ago, on April 4th, 1930, a banquet was held in the President's Gallery downstairs on the first floor of this building to celebrate Dr. Welch's 80th birthday. And as many of you know, Dr. William Welch was the universally acknowledged Dean of American Medicine during the early 20th century and the founder of the Department of History and Medicine at Hopkins. Dr. Greene's interests and research have focused on how medical technologies, electronic communications, and digital media have influenced the nature of medical knowledge, education, and practice, as well as society's perceptions of health and disease. We will be privileged momentarily to learn Dr. Greene's thoughts on what is the role of the historical medical library in our society today, and how the educational structures of the historical medical library will need to evolve as digitization, artificial intelligence, and electronic communication advance. Dr. Greene's talk is entitled, "The Future of the Past in Academic Medicine, Rethinking the Historical Role of the Medical Library." Dr. Greene, I turn the podium over to you.
Thanks so much, David. Thank you for that very generous introduction, and I blush with my ears, and I want you to listen carefully to what I have to say right now. In recent years, we have witnessed a seismic shift in how information is accessed, preserved, and shared. Digitization is the future. That's undeniable, yet the delicate manuscripts, rare medical texts, and artifacts we house remind us that history is not just a collection of data points. These are tangible connections to the intellectual giants on whose shoulders modern medicine stands. However, as technology continues to advance, it's imperative that we strike a balance between preserving the physical artifacts of medical history and embracing digital solutions that expand access to these materials. Our historical collections must become more than static relics. They must be dynamically integrated into the digital landscape, making them accessible to a global audience of researchers, educators, students, and even the public. Okay, that's easier. So I asked you to listen closely to those words, but they're not my words, right? These words are a ChatGPT response to the prompt to prepare a speech on the future of historical collections and medical libraries to an audience interested in continuing their ongoing mission. So how many of you in the room could tell already, based on my diction, that that was generated by a LLM? Okay, so now I would say that, I would say in this case, I don't think it sounds like me. I think it sounds a lot more like Felix Martí-Ibáñez, like a generation of earlier medical historians who talked a lot about standing on the shoulders of giants, because that was very much the orientation of the field. And in the past year, those of us who are teaching undergraduates have learned how to spot generative AI writing. There's a kind of a GPT style, right, that emerges, even when you ask GPT to write in the style of Edgar Allan Poe or Taylor Swift. So after you train the ear, it's actually not that hard to tell the difference. Now, it will become harder, of course, but my students already knew by the first week of class in the seminar I'm teaching for first-year students at Johns Hopkins that this GPT style and the problem of it. So this is more than, I hope, more than just a gag, because when David asked me to speak today, he first of all asked me not to speak as a librarian, right? I'm a great admirer of librarians. I'm deeply appreciative of the work of archivists and of this close engagement between those who manage the future of collections and those who are dependent on their use for discovery in both research and pedagogy, as I am. But David kept stressing the educational and social value of historical medical libraries in the face of advancing digitization and AI. And I will do so today, but I hope to do more, because I think my biggest argument today is that when we raise the specter of digitization and AI, either as hopes or fears, what we're really doing is naming a convenient placeholder for broader underlying fears of the social and educational irrelevance of our institutions, right? A world in which we just don't matter anymore, or a world in which we perceive that these greatly valued treasures that we're responsible for are neglected, devalued, defunded, and discarded, right? And that fear, once we name it, right, predates ChatGPT, right? Now, I respect that fear, and I live with it myself. When I was named the, I think, 8th chair of the William H. Welch Chair of the Institute of History of Medicine at Johns Hopkins in our glorious wood-paneled rooms on the 3rd floor of the Welch Medical Library, one of my first thoughts was, how can I make sure there's a 9th, right? Like, how can I not be the last director of this important institution? How do I help it grow stronger in the process? Now, the answer seemed far from certain. And when this group met a decade ago, or many of you in the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, to discuss the future of historical medical libraries in the digital world then, I was at work on a similar collection with co-authors on making the case for the continued role of history in medical education. And the kind of timing of these things and our revisiting them a decade later, I'd like to focus on a convergence of that today. So I suppose that's really why I'm here, right? So let's start by naming the worst confluence of those fears. Medical students don't use textbooks anymore. Undergraduates in classes tend to call any physical book a novel, even if it's nonfiction. And I'm not trying to make fun of them here. It's like a cultural slippage of the term that has clearly happened. They see physical containers of information we call books and journals as old media, at best a retro media, at worst an inefficient media or a dead media. And all of our institutions, all of the historical medical collections were built on the presumption that physicians turned to history for deeper instruction, valued books, and especially valued rare books that connected modern medicine to a deeper past. So the Yale Medical Library, for example, as many of you know, right, opened in 1941 as the union of the personal collections of 3 prominent Yale faculty members. Here's its opening on June 15, 1941, containing a blessing of the books, right? So this idea that books were these things to be venerated and blessed was fundamental to not all physicians in training, but a certain class of physicians in training for whom it became important and definitional, and because of which we have these institutions we get to work in. So these prior generations of physicians, mostly, who formed the great historical medical libraries in which I was lucky to train in, right? The Boston Medical Library, College of Physicians, Clendening in Kansas City, the Cushing-Whitney at Yale, the Osler in Montreal, our hosts here at the New York Academy of Medicine, and many other institutions represented by those of you who have gathered here in this room today and those of you taking part online. They were founded a lot on the basis of a shared love of books and what to do when that love of books isn't necessarily being transmitted in the same way to future generations. So this feels like a crisis. While there are some young rare book collectors in medicine now in medical school, their numbers are nothing compared to the size that it was before. And I represent probably the last generation of physicians trained with physical textbooks, right? Like, I still have all of them. But with books now seemingly irrelevant to the physicians we train, with generations of students who engage only with medical libraries as virtual elements on browsers, who might make it through 4 years without setting foot in the space of a library or meeting a person called a librarian, how do we ensure that institutions continue to value historical collections, especially in medicine, medical education? All of us know centers that have closed, formerly open stacks that have been moved off-site, staff that have been reduced, formerly bustling reading rooms that have gone silent. When medical institutions produce their 5-year strategic campaigns, it's rare to find library, let alone historical collection, high up in a list of strategic funding priorities, right? So in a forward-looking field, that which does not grow withers. And so the question really today is, how do we get the forward-looking institutions in American medicine to value the past? Now, of course, this itself is the same question from 10 years ago, right? But in the intervening years, I've realized that, like most narratives of doom, this one doesn't fully correspond to the reality that I've been living in, right? Like, interest in history of medicine itself is not withering. And I'd like to get back and lean on the reasons why I'm actually very optimistic about the field itself, but what needs to be done to realign. So the relevance of history in medical education, the engagement of other audiences beyond physicians, as many of you have touched on today, with the vitality of history and historical collections, has grown substantially in the past decade. A profession that's experiencing burnout at record rates is rediscovering and reconsidering the use of historical engagement as a mode of maintaining intellectual investment in a field. And, you know, there's a whole set of opportunities here for us in our collections within this space of recognition. It's up to us to translate that value to new generations of clinicians in training, to broader audiences interested in health and healing, and the possibility, as was first mentioned by Trevor in the first keynote today, of actually using our collections towards the repairing of very well documented, but in many ways fundamentally unacknowledged historical harms to so many different communities that have happened within the walls and outside the walls of our institutions. Now, so there's also this question of reconsidering uses and users, right? The many means by which digitization and even AI offer pathways to appreciate the value of historical collections. And I learned so much, even especially from the last panel of, you know, I've been taking, you know, notes from all of you. There are so many forms of value that can be unlocked in this space, and that our fears of these spaces are understandable, but also the question of whether our values as those who are stewards of these collections in the future are best served by playing into those fears, right, versus finding ways to engage, you know, gloves off as opposed to gloves on manner. I sense I'm talking to a gloves off room for the most part, right? Occasionally we need to wear gloves, especially with, you know, certain things we find in medical collections. But let's talk a bit more about fear first before moving on. So all of us can tell stories of displacement, devaluing, and discard. I think there's an added problem here, which is this knowledge that as medical librarians, we've played a role in our own displacement, right? And I know Jeff Resnick mentioned this in his address 10 years ago at the College of Physicians in Philadelphia. Roughly around the time that took place, there was a feature in the JHU Gazette featuring Nancy Roeder as the librarian at the Welch Medical Library, really kind of grappling with the same problem, holding up an earlier model iPhone. We could probably date exactly which model, right? And suggesting that, you know, what are we going to do as a library when the electronic portal is the dominant means of transformation? And yet we also know, and I'm again playing into Jeff's field in particular, the NLM, that we can trace a story at the National Library of Medicine of the development of the very tools of digitization that then helped medical students not need to go into a library to begin with. Here's some early documentation of the MedLARS program, which I've written extensively about in my last book, The Doctor Who Wasn't There, about some of the early hopes in medical informatics that actually did come to pass, right? So here's unlike many other promises of AI, and I know that Short-Lived is here, and so I would love to follow up on that after coffee, but unlike so many other promises of that era that didn't come to pass of what AI would do for medicine at that moment in time, the informational landscape has become infrastructural and is part of what has displaced our libraries, right? I mentioned also here other ways in which as historians, right, things like early English books online, many other projects, the sort of brilliant work of the Medical Heritage Library, whose, you know, doors, of course, are still open in so many ways, but whose collaboration stopped as of June of this year, and we will mourn that in passing and thank the collaboration for all that it has done. Just a staggering impact on the field, right? More than 350,000 rare books, more than 50 state society journals, all of which have been instrumental to my research and my trainees. But we see this within a narrative of displacement. And I'm going to give you some pictures about displacement. So here's the Welch Medical Library in the Johns Hopkins campus on the left, circa 1940. You can sort of see it. It's really basically in here. It's kind of a central node that connects the laboratories and basic science classrooms with the hospital over here, right? And if you look on the map, I'll demonstrate this a slightly different way, maybe a bit easier than me walking around. So there's the Welch Medical Library, and if you see, it stands in between the preclinical teaching building where all the auditoriums were, first and second year classrooms in the Flexnerian model, and the hospital complex. So it's a mediating space in which you need to pass through the library. Information comes from labs into the library. Medical students go to the library to connect the hospital with the labs and the lecture halls. There's a School of Public Health across the street. But at roughly the same time that David Jones and John Harley Warner and Jackie Duffin and I wrote this article 10 years ago, and you all had this conference 10 years ago, the geography of medical education shifted to a new building, the Armstrong Medical Education Building at Johns Hopkins, which is about as far away as you can be from the library, right? So the library was utterly marginalized within the flows of medical education and clinical practice, residents from the hospital, students from the wards. And this happened at exactly this moment of this feared shift being realized of the predominance of journal materials being and textbooks becoming available electronically. So now this kind of displacement can happen without moving the library at all, right? We were displaced without being moved. And I think a similar thing happened at Countway Medical Library. And I want to thank Scott Podolsky, Jessica Murphy, and Elaine Martin from Countway for sharing this strategic document with me. They've done their own revisioning on this. And here you see a document in which they acknowledge that the Countway is right next to the Brigham and Women's Hospital. It's right there on the quad of Harvard Medical School with the basic science buildings, right? There's a School of Public Health. And yet the text here, designed with its back to the community and limited access into the library. So this sense that even when it's properly situated, forms of displacement can occur. So this is a broader question I really would like us to engage with today, which is, it's not just the historical collections themselves that are displaced, right? It's the entire space of the medical library. And I think that actually seeing these fates as linked, as I know many of you already do, is, I think, crucial for our mutual strategic well-being in the future as we engage with digitization and AI and other technological thresholds that are the displacement for our own fears. So to illustrate why we should also look to non-medical libraries for inspiration, which is my other main trope today. So again, if you fall asleep, if you get called out of the room, these are these things I want you to remember. I'm very lucky to get to work at Hopkins with Ann Seymour, who's here today, the Dean of the Welch Medical Library, a brilliant lateral thinker. And shortly after I became chair, Ann invited me to take a site visit together, and we took a train up before the pandemic to the newly opened Kislak Special Collections Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And how many of you have had a chance to go to the Kislak? So I think partly what's so inspirational about this place, and here you see the new architectural drawings, here you can see a bit of this beautiful natural light coming into these shared spaces, is that these formerly separated collections, right? The Rare Book and Manuscript Library, the Furness Memorial Shakespeare Library, the Edgar Foss Smith Memorial Collections, the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies, all of them were banded together, elevated to this penthouse, this kind of glorious new architecture, which became a highly desirable space on campus. And now, I'm not saying we can reproduce this immediately, but I want to quote here the late Weill Noel, who, for those of you who knew Weill, he passed away this May, far too soon. Many of you also mourn him as a lost colleague. But he was quoted here in the Penn Gazette in this article called, Ancient Books Get a Modern Temple. What drove that space was the use. The real change will be in the visibility of the collections for the undergraduates and graduate community and their ability to work with these materials in their daily life in a setting that's frankly pretty amazing. So these things, values, uses, and users, are inextricably bound together, right? And as we project our fears into this space, what we really must do is constantly focus on how we generate the forms of engagement that then propel cycles of visibility, more use, more capacious sense of users. And it is these things that allow our collections together to actually get elevated and receive the forms of investment and visibility they deserve. That's my basic message. But what drives use, right? How are the values of our collections understood? So the Countway Medical Library recently went through a similar space evaluation before the pandemic. And again, not just for the historical collections, but for the entire medical library. And I want to keep stressing the point that this future is tied. Many of the things identified as value problems in the Countway review may seem painful to this audience, right? If we start looking at this text, art, and that's basically, I think that's the Econ Clinic. I'm not quite sure actually which clinic it is represented, but art not representative of current community, large outdated service and staff workspaces, large on-site collections, like the idea that having a large on-site collection on site would be a demerit it's like kind of a dagger for, a historical researcher, and yet one can understand that when you think of all of the users of a library, what actually makes it a usable space today is very different from how these institutions were imagined originally. Dark, intimidating interiors. I mean, like so many of these buildings were built on this beauty of dark, intimidating interiors. That was the whole point, right? Here's the Yale again, I could take us through the Jacobs Reading Room in the Institute of History of Medicine at Hopkins. But as hard as it is to see these devaluations, it forces this larger reconsideration of what actually history and historical is, who the intended user is, what values are expressed in these aesthetics, and how we need to adapt. So a library like Yale Medical Library started as a collection of historical texts collected by gentlemen physicians, and that architecture reflects these class values, right? It's not just a time, but it's also a kind of person that is valued in that space, right? And I want to point out this argument, which I'm going to come to at the end, which these collections, these libraries started as personal collections by physicians who could collect them, and that's still a key element of how we build our collections today. They banded together to become more generally available for people only within the medical profession, typically at elite schools. And we have been working, we've heard so much today about ways of working to actually broaden the nature and content and accessibility of these collections beyond these spaces. And this is a recapitulation of Robert Darnton's argument about the long arc of the history of the library in general, right? Expanded over a longer time span, like, centuries. And this idea that the arc of the mission of the library and librarianship has always bent towards increasing the openness of access and inclusion in that space is something that really puts us in a very homologous space with a broader project of librarianship. Now, whether or not we need a cafe, I think so. I recognize that what I call a love affair with coffee is more properly described as an addiction, but I still think that these kinds of imaginations of space, it's not just about do we have a cafe or do we have a retail space, right? But it's do we imagine in an inclusive sense who our users are in a way that we can actually turn a vicious cycle of exclusion, which is really how all of our institutions were built, into a virtuous cycle that is not only reparative but also inclusive in really meaningful ways. And so part of that involves thinking not just of the rare books as the historical collections, but realizing that every single physical object that is in these stacks of the Welch Medical Library is a historical collection at this point in time, right? Now, I talked with Anne about this because we should say that, but we shouldn't say it too loud because I don't want that to be perceived as it is just a laboratory for historians. But it is a laboratory, and translating the value of that laboratory for the discovery project of medicine, public health, biomedical science in general, that's our task. And these are things where our ability, as Paulina was mentioning earlier, to make these materials data accessible and data searchable using tools of digitization and AI that help responsible methods bring questions of discovery that are meaningful and unlock the potential of our collections. Yes, there's the fear that somehow we'll put it out there, we'll use it to train better AI, and will just be part of this whole macabre process of AI taking over the world. But in some intermediary, like we are the stewards who can actually help make sure it's actually used responsibly in a way that helps our collections be understood as vital laboratories for medical discovery that is not just for a small group of historians, right, but that is actually for the broader missions of these institutions. And here I'm just appealing a bit to the architecture of the original History of Medicine division at the National Library of Medicine, which is a very different kind of a view, right, from the Jacobs Room or the Yale Medical Library. And this very much is understanding the library as a laboratory from the moment of its 60s construction. So on some level, this is where when the Countway report points to the problem of space, if the entirety of the physical collections are understood to be historical, it becomes a value proposition, right? And that how do we make it clear that this is not wasted space, right? That this is space of active discovery that's actively tied to pedagogy as well. And we need to make that proposition, that value proposition whole, both for discovery and for medical education. So I'll give you one example. Like, since I'm lingering on the Countway, the top floor is the offices of the New England Journal of Medicine. And digitization, OCR, generative AI can help us in this process. They're not a panacea. Left by themselves can destroy us, of course, as we have destroyed ourselves successively already with earlier iterations in digitization. But they offer tools to make this value proposition. So about 10 years ago, when we started working together on this, David Jones, Scott Podolsky, and I realized that we could use the digitization, the full text mapping of the corpus of the New England Journal of Medicine to make a proposal to the journal to engage with history as a methodology in the way that had not been willing to do so before. And we had been trying for a while to get history as research published in this highly impactful medical journal, and we had been unsuccessful. But we had a final breakthrough after this digitization, full text access, on the edge of the 200th anniversary of the journal. And we proposed a series of articles on how we could take themes, track them through the digital corpus, and produce methodologies that could actually be understandable and graspable to a journal editor in clinical medicine as research. And these were not celebratory pieces. There's one on the evolving role of the medical journal. There's one on the transformation of epidemiology and definition of disease. And we did one on therapeutic evolution and the enduring challenge of rational medicine. They're critical examinations of how a corpus of a digitized medical journal could add new value to historical investigations. And at that point, these were probably the most impactful pieces any of us had yet written, and they were all made possible by this digitized corpus. Now, we built on this, the article that I mentioned before, and I can stump about the sort of 5 key elements in which history is vital to medical education. We could talk about needing to have a dynamic conception of disease, because the understanding of disease, and by the time one is practicing, is going to be fundamentally different from the moment of entering training. We can talk about how therapeutic knowledge is always mobile and efficacy itself is always rooted in context. We can talk about the persistence of inequalities in health and the fact that health disparities are a meaningless topic if we don't actually include a historical axis of argument. Or we can talk about how ethics itself and dilemmas of practice and policy only make sense with historical contextualization. Again, I can stump about these every day. You know, here's some slides. But what I want to get to is what happened after I left Boston to move down to Baltimore. Scott and David continued to help foster this wide-ranging series of historical articles. And actually, this has just opened the door. There's so much history that's been published in the journal now as a result. And it's not just as a result of digitization, but it's instrumentally using that digital corpus in a way to potentiate critical self-reflection, history as a reparative field, and that reparative work being urgently necessary. So more crucially, in the wake of the summer of 2020, when there was a renewed awareness in our country across so many, almost all of our institutions, about this dual pandemic of COVID-19 and structural racism colliding in the protests following the murder of George Floyd, this digital corpus became a space for a really important self-examination of the New England Journal of Medicine, of its own complicity in a variety of topics. How we think about historical bias, for example, understanding the New England Journal of Medicine's own complicity with various institutions of enslavement, understanding ways in which the codification and discrimination and marginalization of Native Americans was present through the history of the journal. And again, this is more than just self-flagellation, right? All of these pieces are how do we use history to actually engage and embody a more inclusive present for the profession, right? But also for what it is that healthcare should be doing as a site of repair of visible disparities rather than propagation. And in Baltimore, right during the pandemic, at Hopkins, we put together an idea, with partly with the help and vision of Mario Molina, who had, helped to establish a new symposium series on how to make history of medicine practically relevant for practice and policy. And we, through a conference on reckoning with race and racism in academic medicine, we realized that Hopkins, this built on a segregated hospital, just had never had a public engagement with that legacy, and that part of our role as an institution of history of medicine, collections, should be to help facilitate what we could do in that space. Now, it was the largest event our institute has ever thrown. We had 200 people in person. This was right as the pandemic was opening up. It was the first conference I went to after the pandemic. Well, I didn't go anywhere, but people came. But we had 1,000 people online. We had never had that kind of engagement before. We had representatives from the American Medical Association, the AAMC, 20 different medical schools. And the last panel was by a group, featured a project called the Repair Project. And this was by Jason Glenn, a historian at Kansas University Medical Center, the Clendenning Libraries there, Amy Medeiros and Antoine Johnson at UCSF, and of course we have representatives from the sort of visionary UCSF medical collections here, and it involved a reflection of how and where Black actors are and are not included in our collections, right? So there is a paucity of collection of Black actors as physicians or healthcare workers, right, in archives that enshrine sort of heroic healthcare workers until very, very, very late, right? And then there's a predominance, of course, of many black actors and race and racialization of diagnosis, of treatment, of who is a research subject, are there all within our archives, but in a way unseen and unexamined. And one of the things that the Repair Project did, and this was an attempt on both of these schools to find ways that these institutions could use history and other social sciences to help shift this recursive process by which academic medicine reproduces forms of biological racism, right, tacitly. Even today, whether it's with genomics or spirometers or how we calculate, kidney failure, and instead shift towards being a site of repair. And part of what Jason Glenn had done at Kansas University Medical Center was to think of oral history as kind of an activist tool for inclusion in who's part of the archives. Now, Paulina spoke about UCSF's work in this vein, but it is a form of radical inclusivity that acknowledges and reshapes the violence of the archives and the nature of our collections and allows us to actually affect these forms of change. So we then actually moved along with this. Johns Hopkins also came up with a different contribution to this repair space. It had to do with how we envision how history of medicine can be woven through the medical curriculum. How does history, that we need to understand historically how biomedicine has perpetuated racism and has reinforced theories of racial difference, that we actually have a space in which we can work to abolish forms of medical racism, right? The GFR no longer race discriminates in kidney function at Johns Hopkins. Our pulmonary lab no longer race discriminates. We can become a site for visualizing and disaggregating ways in which race becomes commonsensically reinforced through, and history is crucial to that. We can actually promote structural competency and a competency-based training in which we focus on racism rather than race to understand disparity. And it takes not just history, but history in partnership with other social sciences, epidemiology, and clinical teaching to do this. But there's a lot of productive work there. And then also think about accountability. How can we become a site of repair? So now, we found extraordinary receptivity in the undergraduate medical education deans at Hopkins. And then just this last May, we then held a workshop in partnership with the AMA and the AAMC, and representatives of 40 schools of medicine that have been leaning into teaching structural competency and social science in these spaces and using history as a means to imagine and affect reparative change in medicine. So I'm not trying to I really don't want to do a form of bragging here, right? I really want to check that and speak humbly with, on some level, how little we've been able to accomplish and how much there is still to do, and yet how important the work is, not just for the historians and not just for those who manage our collections, but also opening new sites of engagement with those communities that we have supposed to have been serving and working in partnership with, building lateral cross-institutional strategic goals, and being able to actually influence national educational bodies on the role of the kind of work we all do. So I want to close and give us time for conversation. I want to focus a little bit about users, though, because in the field of history of medicine, there's this kind of it's a tale that keeps getting told about how this is a field that was first created by physicians in this country, and libraries like my own were initially run by MDs, and then it was, there was kind of a hijacking in a very productive way by a group of social historians, and then there's the PhDs, and then there's some people like me who are MD PhDs, and everybody's suspicious of us, or we're going to solve all the problems. But in a way, I think that's still talking about this. All of this is still happening with this incredibly elite space in which you need a doctorate to actually be at the table, right? And so I want to point this out because I want to point out that part of the reason I'm here today, right, is that my friend Harriet Washington invited me, right, and suggested that it would be really good if I got more engaged with the New York Academy of Medicine because she is taking on a leadership role in building spaces for history of medicine at the New York Academy of Medicine. Now, Harriet, I'm not trying to out Harriet here, but is not an MD or a PhD, right? She is an incredible journalist and author, right, who is dedicated to historical analysis and its meaning in the present, whose work has inspired, actually at this point, successive generations of people with MDs and PhDs that are now leaning into this field. But I want to just highlight that, that if we think about our collections as either for medicine or for PhD history, we lose out on populations of like extraordinary people that are doing work that is so vitally meaningful. I mean, Medical Apartheid is an incredible book. The like 5 other books that she's written through them are also like remarkable and pose questions. Harriet and I currently serve together on a task force for the American Medical Association that focuses on ways that history can be used as a reparative vehicle, and what the AMA, including the AMA's archival space, can actually do to help actually be accessible and accountable for understanding and reckoning with historical harms. So materials for this kind of research aren't necessarily found within the historical collections as they were originally founded, right? If we exclude the modern journals, right? But once we think about everything in all of our libraries as historical, right? Like what brought me into the New York Academy of Medicine was the physical collection practices of this institution, right? So I was doing a project about pharmaceutical marketing. Medical journals, when collected in most medical libraries, most librarians had cut out the ads to bind them together. For some reason, here at the New York Academy of Medicine, whoever had been collecting them didn't cut the ads out. Now, this may have actually cost a bit more money in terms of binding and storing space, ultimately an inefficiency, right? It was a glorious inefficiency for me because this then became this archive. Now, JAMA had already been digitized, but not with the ads at that point, and I could come and look at the JAMA collections here and look at the ads and find in full color these advertisements for anti-hypertensive or anti-diabetic agents that I was tracing and help build an argument about the unseen ways in which medical marketing actually shaped medical knowledge and medical practice. So that was a key basis for the research in my first book, Prescribing by Numbers, Drugs and the Definition of Disease. And I'm highlighting it as one of the many ways in which the digital can actually draw you into a collection, but then help you become aware of the physical affordances that can only be actually appreciated once you're in that space. Now, this other question of who else is interested in what's inside of our walls and who can use them, there's so many unknown unknowns in this space, and we only open them up when we start building on-roads into them. Polina talked about this, Trevor talked about this earlier as well. This is a demonstration of some of the remarkable work my colleague Martha Jones in the history department is doing at Hopkins, and a project called Hard Histories at Hopkins. It really began after the disclosure of the slave census that disclosed that our benefactor and namesake of the university, that his personal estate in Clifton Park had enslaved peoples registered as having been living there, and this forced a re-examination of how we understand the myths that we tell ourselves about our institutions and how we hold ourselves accountable to re-examine them. What you're seeing here is a re-examination of a forgotten institution, right? Everyone thinks about Johns Hopkins, Weill, and the existence of Johns Hopkins University as a prominent research university, or the School of Medicine and the hospital. But there was a third institution, the Colored Orphans Asylum, which was forgotten about. And the young women, all black, who were chronicled up to a certain point, and then effectively at the age of 18, childless African-American girls who were then raised in a particular institution up till the age of 18 and then placed as domestic workers in white middle-class households in Baltimore and then went off ledger and forgotten about. And so this is a reparative project to find out, using geolocated work, using a variety of digital humanities techniques, as much as could be learned about a series of forgotten people who actually have namesakes, descendants living, and many of them still in working relations with the Johns Hopkins community. Now, again, this is not all self-flagellation. This is a question of how we think more broadly about the communities that might actually be interested in the collections inside of our walls, but with whom we haven't thought to build relationships that could be reparative. So, again, this value of history and reckoning and repair, it might seem threatening at first, right, to the narratives of progress and great men that our institutions were built on. But in many ways, this accountability can actually help us double down on the missions that our institutions are actually pledged to. And now this spirit was very visible in the summer of 2020. A prominent New York Times Magazine article that showed by the summer of 2023 how many Black Lives Matter murals were fading and being physically erased from the geography of American cities, and how quickly we can forget those promises. I still think that there are so many spaces in which our ability to lean in, that window that opened, allows historical collections to do crucial reparative work that actually benefits us all. And so, of course, part of what drives use is understanding our collections are not just books, but objects and many things behind. I want to point out here one of our newest collections, this exquisitely presented collection of otolaryngological instruments donated by Bob Rubin, who's sitting here, was just launched as an exhibition with the assistance of our new curator, Michael Seminara, and Jay Virdi, a historian of medicine, disability, and technology, who really produced a fabulous catalog, which will have an online presence, which we are hoping will draw in more users into the space. But we already have students coming into the space and engaging with these materials. Here you can see my colleague Lauren Ludwig, who is teaching a class about sense and science and using a monochord with a group of PhD students. Here is an undergraduate or pre-medical student coming and engaging with our historical collections of stethoscopes. And this is just to illustrate, again, we're gloves-off people, right? And we need to find way, and the existence of a digital wrapper around our objects help find pathways in. I only have a couple more slides to share with you, and one has to do with how we can engage in the space with born digital collections. Paulina mentioned briefly a collaboration that we've had between UCSF and Johns Hopkins, the OIDA, the Opioid Industry Document Archives. I can tell you how we together as historians and archives put together an amicus curiae brief as part of the opioid settlements to suggest that we have a responsibility to make open access and to at this point, millions and millions of documents that have come out of these legislations. But again, at that scale and at a born digital level, it presents a set of problems and opportunities. I've learned so much through this project, but part of what we've done is generated a toolbox through an engagement team that can help people gain the skills to learn how to do data mining through the work, right? Part of what this toolbox does is also offers on-ramps for educational pathways to help K through 12 educators understand how they can get their students to start doing projects that get them into the collections. Now, this doesn't necessarily get people into our physical libraries, but it does drive use in such a powerful way. I'll mention here briefly my colleague Mary Fassell, who again spoke at the last one at College of Physicians of Philadelphia, that using metadata to enhance the ability to create visualizations around readerships of books, even if they're all available digitally on EEBO, can actually help individual users understand and map the specific qualities of the specific physical text that they need to visit, right? So this collection maps difference, right? So that through a variety of pull-down levers, folks can understand where different versions of the same book are published, right? Who published them, what time they're published, what thematics are engaged in. And I'll just, end by talking about ways in which I've become wrapped up in forms of AI that I didn't expect. Again, we have the massive scale of chronicling America at the Library of Congress. I know Trevor already touched upon just the massiveness of these sorts of projects. And what do you do when you have more than 20 million pages worth of materials, right? You have to learn to operate at scale in the sense of the scalar logic of what's possible. This project, the viral text sharing project, is one, it's not a medical project specifically, right? But it is an example of how careful engagement with digital resources being developed through LOC at scale can lead to extraordinary forms of network mapping that leads to paths of discovery. In this case, how media moves along railroad lines. And if I were to zoom in on one of these dots, you just see the density of information exchange that is being actually reproduced through this analysis. And I was a Kluge Fellow at the Library of Congress the past year working with Ben Lee, a computer scientist with substantial interest in digital humanities who Trevor already mentioned earlier. And other fellows who had skills in this and the ability to dip into GitHub that I did not and had never done before. And I'm working on a project right now about medical waste. I'm very interested in syringes and how they get thrown out and who gets blamed when they wash up on shore. And there's this moment in which I realized that some of these newspaper accounts I was looking at how, everyone's blaming these junkies, that the junkies are leaving their needles on the shore. It's a syringe, it's a junkie. And then others were suggesting, well, there are these very responsible diabetics whose materials may still somehow be washed up. And these are diabetic needles, so then they're not from the junkies or something else, something legitimate is going on and the reason they're coming on board. And I started realizing that there's this moral valence with the syringe between this figure of the junkie and this figure of the diabetic. And so we actually wound up looking through, millions of pages of Circulating America, finding thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of articles about syringes, tagging the moral valence through a GitHub screen of a positive or negative valence, putting them through time, and being able to not just visualize where diabetes and insulin was versus heroin and junkies, but then also you could zoom in and then grab any one of those articles and look at it. So you all know the wonders that digital humanities can do. This is a project about railroads. I'll just close with this one last piece, that this is a project about railroads that I was showing you earlier. It's not my project, it's the viral text sharing project showing railroad networks. This, however, is the atrium of the B&O Railroad Museum. Have any of you been there? Yeah, it's a remarkable space. And the day I was there for this picture, there was actually a auction going on of stolen vehicles. that was using the rail yards as in there were all these Lamborghinis. One of them had actually like Power Rangers stenciled. It was beautiful. But I was there because the archivist, the people who run the museum had in a back closet found a series of file drawers they hadn't realized were there. And those file drawers contained millions of pages, 16 million pages of health records from the first half of the 20th century. And it turns out the B&O Railroad, fascinating study in the history of corporations, right? A major corporation, in many ways a definitional corporation, right? That working across time zones, as Alfred Chandler told us, four kinds of management that help to build corporate structure. But it seems that they're one of the first, if not the first, companies to provide a health benefit for their employees. Now, we didn't know this, right? Here's discovery, accidental discovery. But 16 million documents, there's no way I can handle that, right? I'm just coming back from sabbatical and I can barely manage faculty meetings, right? So I've teamed up with a new faculty member, Lou Hyman, a postdoctoral fellow, Sam Backer, who, now Lou is a business historian, very interested in the technology industry, also very interested in thinking with AI models. And we put together a small grant. We batch digitized, there's probably about a couple 100,000 people, 16 million documents. We took a sample, and we realized that if you look at all of these documents, they're arranged in folders. And the folders are all custom printed, right? So clearly there's a form of information that is coded into the way the data is entered here. It's all analog, it's inaccessible. But with OCR, some handwriting recognition required, right? We ran a few tries, and we realized that actually you could generate reasonable self-organizing database into SQL databases through generative AI models that could then batch test and create a usable database in a way that none of us would be able to otherwise. Now, this is just one small example. I'm giving you my own story, right? As I would admit, a technologically unsophisticated historian who prefers to sit in a room and read books, right? Or read through archives, read other people's mail as a solitary person, and is learning how to do this work at scale. But at the same time, I'm illustrating this as something the edge of my knowledge and ability, the sort of thing I realize we must help to potentiate as the future of our fields. So in both researching, whether it's learning Python, learning SQL databases, it's as valid as learning French or German for PhD students in our fields. And even though I don't have those skills, I need to learn how to devise training programs that researchers can. And similarly, within the field of collections management, how to think about the skills that you all need in this space to actually match up in the middle. And I know that the prior panel did a better job of that than I could possibly do. So I'll just summarize. We're moving beyond fears, reconsidering changing values, uses, and users of our collections. What is historic about historical collections, right? Well beyond rare books, but also how we understand that every physical thing in the medical library is also a historical collection now. We draw strength from learning about libraries in general, that values, uses, and users are functionally inseparable, and that we have the ability to transform vicious cycles of displacement into virtuous cycles of elevation and use. And I'll conclude by saying, many of you know Darnton's argument on the long term, which focuses on undoing 5 key myths, as he puts them, right, in the Jeremiads of the library. These myths are: the book is dead. The myth is we have entered the information age. The myth is all information is now available online. The myth is libraries are obsolete. The myth is the future is digital. And all seem commonsensical. We can refute all of them. But we have to understand this within this larger arc of the library. And this bend towards openness, as threatening as it seems, and as much as we need to watch out to not inadvertently help in doing ourselves in along the way, that actually we are recapitulating in a more compressed time frame in historical medical libraries over this past century, this longer arc of the library and how we work to actually accomplish all we can through inclusion, engagement, and productive exchange. So with that, I really thank you for your time. I've learned so much here today. Thank you for including me. And I realize that I've gone a bit over, but I'm hoping there might be time for a couple of questions. Yes?
Everybody in this room loves libraries. everybody here loves libraries. What I read in the paper is more and more of college students have nothing to do with history, literature, and so on. The numbers majoring in those subjects are going down. The faculties are shrinking. STEM is going up. You're an in-between generation. I'm a generation ahead of you. What's the difference? Are the medical students coming in today interested in historic collections? Do they have a whole different set of values because they've prepared so intensively with their sciences and moved away from much in the way of humanities during that period of preparation?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll try and answer briefly, but you know, I think the sort of the continued death knell for the humanities and the reductions in humanities majors, even in fields like history, right, is something we need to continue to reckon with. I'm currently this year the chair of a program called the undergraduate program Medicine, Science, and Humanities at Johns Hopkins, which is at present our largest humanities major. And it's the largest humanities major because Hopkins, which has such an overwhelming set of undergraduate interests in pre-medical and pre-engineering spaces, see ways of engaging productively in history and other humanistic fields through this space. So we find that there's actually wait lists for all of our classes. So there's undergraduate demand for these materials, but it has required some creative repackaging. And one of the things that I try to do very carefully in this program is to make sure that this funnels students into humanities minors and majors rather than taking students away from the robustness of humanistic disciplines or humanities disciplines. But as far as what we see when students arrive in the first year medical school, I mean, I sat on this AAMC panel on the fundamental role of arts and humanities in medical education, which came out about 2 years ago. And it's actually had a lot of uptake pre-medically as well as in medical schools. And we see this growth in medical humanities programs, much like we saw growth in global health programs earlier. There's a lot of undergraduate interest of thinking about what needs to be learned through critical inquiry in humanities and social sciences field on an undergraduate basis. And pre-medical advisors are actually pushing more of this rather than less compared to when I was an undergraduate. That being said, it's a paradox, right? So our students arrive. I had been teaching about race correction in pulmonary testing and kidney testing for about 10 years before this transformation finally occurred. And the transformation didn't just occur because we had a national conversation after George Floyd's death. It occurred because medical students started arriving in medical school with tools of critical analysis using historical and anthropological and STS queries to forcibly confront their professors in physiology in a way that somehow I had not successfully done, right? Into reckoning the racism that was built into the space and the historic basis of it and why it needed to be undone. So in a way, I'm very optimistic about what those students coming into medical school can do. It's just that they don't locate this in books as physical objects. In a way, they find it through historical analysis rather than specific historical texts at this point. And I think that's the kind of reorientation that becomes important to effect. Well, I'll be here all week. Actually, I'll be here till 8 p.m. tonight. But,